Hello, good evening, everyone. Today we have Prof. Amy Shuman with us. Prof. Amy Shuman does not require an introduction. She is a world-famous folklorist, narrative theory specialist, and a very fine disability studies scholar. She teaches at Ohio State University. Among many other distinguished awards, she's a Guggenheim Fellow. The topic I want to discuss with the problem of storytelling, and I call today's topic as Other People's Stories, a conversation with Amy Shuman. Why stories? Well, disability is immersed in many narrative universes. Disability in itself is a gathering of narrative universes, and people ask why, what happened, how it happened. Blind people may ask, where is it, who is that, and that in turn may prompt newer plots, newer modes of listening, newer modes of connectivities, and hence the relevance of the idea of other people's stories. Thanks so much, Amy, for coming on board here. I feel so privileged to have you here.
The privilege is entirely mine. Thank you for inviting me.
Let's begin like this, Amy. Why people tell stories, and what are stories? Shall we begin that way?
Sure. So I'll start with the why. I think people tell stories because they want to understand something. They want to understand the past. They want to understand something that just happened. They want to understand another person, or they want to understand themselves. I call that the promise of storytelling. It's a very compelling promise, and it extends to anything from fairy tales or mythologies or religious stories. So the promise is very different depending on whether the promise is to tell some vital truth about humanity or to explain something that happened yesterday. But nonetheless, that's the promise. And I don't think we succeed in that promise. I think we often fail, which interests me, but I don't think that it stops us from trying. So I think it's more of a process, and it's a dialogue. So it involves the teller and the listener. So we tell in order to create this relationship among people, among tellers, listeners, future listeners, ourselves. So that's the why do we tell stories part. What is a story is a simple question. That a story tells that something happened. That's the simplest definition. Something happened, and if you tell it in such a way that you say this happened, if you reverse the order of what you said, you would get a different story. So a story requires some temporal dimension where first this happened and then that happened, though they aren't necessarily told in that order, but it requires us to understand some kind of temporality. So that's the really basic definition.
And there are, depending on the listener, stories change and the storyteller changes. Does that happen?
Yes, there's quite a bit of interesting research on children telling stories. The idea is that children first get the idea of the temporality before they get the idea of a solution. So they might tell a story, I went to the store, I jumped in a puddle, I bought some candy, but you never get any sense of where it's going or what the resolution might be. It might even be that I jumped in a puddle and my boots got wet, but you never find out what happened and whether your boots got dry. So very, very young children, certainly 2-year-olds can tell stories, but by the time children are 8 years old, they have figured out how to tell a resolution. That is, that they've told you a story where there was a problem and it got solved. So that's another definition of story, that there's a problem, and very young children can tell the problem part, but then solving the problem it comes a bit later. And of course, people tell stories all through their lives and tell very different kinds of stories in their lifetimes.
In Indian schools, Amy, children call that moral of the story. So when I tell a young child, say 7 or 8, they used to ask me, "Uncle, where is the moral of the story? You tell me first."
Right. So the moral of the story is usually an additional explanation. The moral of the story tells you how to understand it. And that's even more important. So it's one thing to say, my boots were wet, I dried them off. So you have a problem and a solution. And another to say the moral of the story, which is, what is the purpose of this story? What is it supposed to tell me? That's far more important. And many people who study narrative believe that that's the most important part. It's been called by one of the narrative scholars, whose name is William Labov, Labov. William Labov calls it the evaluative part of the story, the so what. So every story should answer the question, so what? You shouldn't end by saying doesn't matter. So the moral is really very, very important. And it's interesting that children learn that so young.
So resolution, moral, expectation, and all that then make stories travel dynamically. And you call it travel. What does that mean, Amy, travel of the story?
Well, one of the questions that has really interested me most is that question: why do stories travel from one teller to another, from different listeners to more tellers to more listeners? And what are the restrictions on that? Who owns the story? Does the story belong to the person who experienced it? Some would ask, or I've asked also, does it belong to the person who suffered the experience? Does it, and what happens when somebody else tells your story? Do you feel that they have spread the word in a good way, or do you feel that they have exploited you by taking your story? This is very, very important in disability studies, this question of who owns the story. So I would say, yes, stories travel. That a good story is maybe defined by the fact that it travels. If you hear a story and think it's good, you're likely to tell it to someone else. So stories travel. But at the same time, we have claims on our stories. And the claim is related to what you were talking about earlier about the moral or the interpretation of the story. So when stories travel, does the moral travel with it? Or does someone tell the story and give it a new interpretation, which isn't the interpretation that you might have given it? And I would say, yes, that's what happens, is that stories travel, they acquire new morals or new interpretations, and they move from one place to another. All kinds of things change, and some things remain the same.
So when a disabled person feels, look, you have misrepresented me or misappropriated my story, can those claims be validated, or how does one respond to such claims in the first place?
So I think every culture has rules, norms, etiquette for who should tell whose stories. So I'll start there. And some cultures actually have written these down, and or have inscribed them in some way in a sense of very familiar understanding of when you should or should not tell something you've heard about someone else, something that is not yours to tell. Most cultures have those, and there's terrific research on that as well, on rumor, gossip, and the culturally specific understandings of who should tell whose stories. So we have that to go on. In addition, though, people with disabilities face a different sort of challenge, which is that very often people with disabilities aren't granted those rights. That is, that if there are norms and conventions for who should tell whose stories, very often people with disabilities are excluded from those. To call attention to that, in the United States anyway, there's a mantra, a phrase. I don't know if you have it also there, because it's nothing about us without us. It's a rhyme in English, nothing about us without us. And it's very specific to the disability rights movement, because people with disabilities are accustomed to being spoken for. That is, no matter whether they're in a doctor's office where they're present and they might be there with a caretaker who's there for mobility issues having nothing to do with cognitive issues, or maybe it is cognitive issues, they aren't given the opportunity to speak for themselves, and instead they're spoken for. This is such a problem for people with disabilities that this phrase has now become this mantra, nothing about us without us. So what can people with disabilities do? I think we need to be very vocal, speak up about the fact that people with disabilities have a right to speak for themselves and can speak for themselves, even if they have cognitive difficulties. We have to find the way to let them speak for themselves. So the burden should be on the listener to figure out what's the way to let this person speak for themselves. And there's some very interesting research on that too. A woman named Val Williams, who recorded conversations between people with intellectual disabilities and others, and a care worker was present usually, and the others would listen to what the person with intellectual disabilities said, completely not listen, would hear it, but not listen. Then the person with the caregiver would rephrase it or say it again, and the person who was listening would pay attention to the caregiver. And Val Williams showed in her tape recordings that the person with intellectual disabilities said it perfectly clearly the first time. In every case, it just was a matter of listening to them, and they were being disregarded because they have intellectual disabilities.
That's true. Well, in Indian context, nothing about us without us is as a mantra in itself is catching up with people who are familiar with Western discourse and also who can speak English and connect to it. But the spirit of it, the idea of self-assertion, the idea that one ought to be one ought to speak, otherwise it'll go out of my control. It is there in different modalities in the grassroots disability movements, and also they are borrowed from other identity movements such as the Dalit movement and different farmer movements and other identities and so on. So it is there, and one can also add the idea that the ways in which one names oneself, one gives oneself a name. I am blind, I am visually impaired, I am visually challenged, or I am, I am A, B, and C. That now it's becoming clear that how one should call oneself, how one should present one's own story should belong to people themselves. People from outside maybe have to deal with it, maybe have to connect with it, but not determine the business of naming oneself. So that seems to be also the work happening at the grassroots and in the academic environments. That's my response to how it happens here.
Yes, and it's very interesting that it occurs also with those other movements, with the Dalit movement or the farmers movement, and it's very related to storytelling. So one way to take back the presentation of oneself is to tell one's own story. So that's becoming, in a fascinating way, a central part of disability studies, that is disability memoir, where people with disabilities tell their own stories and tell them in a very self-critical way. But we could get to that. There's some problems that you face immediately telling your own story as well. It can still be taken from you, even though you tell it yourself. Just want to mention here that my work on this follows one of my teachers. His name was Irving Goffman, Goffman, and he wrote a book called The Presentation of Self in Everyday Life. That was one of his first books that is about the difficulty of presenting oneself in everyday life. What are the things that compromise the possibility of presenting yourself? Tied to that, and a book he wrote later, he wrote a book called Stigma, which is about the ways that society labels particular kinds of difference as what he calls a spoiled identity. So he's using that a bit tongue in cheek to say that because he doesn't believe that your identity is spoiled, he's trying to demonstrate the ways that identity gets spoiled by people who stigmatize others. He doesn't talk enough about disability because that wasn't his topic, but all kinds of stigmatized identities and how they help someone then, if your identity is spoiled because you have a disability, then how do you present yourself in everyday life? How do you restore your sense of yourself against this other presentation of you? So part of it is with narrative, we could talk about this more, is that for people with disabilities and for many others, your own narrative starts to serve as a counter narrative. That is, there are already narratives about you. So when we say nothing about us without us, it's not that we get to start fresh. There really isn't nothing about us without us. The truth is there's already something about us without us, and we need to tell a counter narrative because we want to tell our own story to contrast with that story that's already being told about us. And the stories told about people with disabilities are so prolific. They're everywhere. And they're in, religious tracts, they're in fairy tales, they're in all kinds of fiction. People like to tell stories about people with disabilities. We often don't get to find out much about them in the story. They just are a person with a disability and they motivate the plot somehow, or they serve as a kind of spoiled identity of some kind. But because there are so many stories about us already, then to tell our own story becomes a counter narrative in a good way.
Can one call it also counter diagnosis? Because it is also a critique of diabolic narratives about disability that do the rounds around. In fact, in a very prolific way. So can one call it that way, Amy?
Absolutely. Absolutely. That's a good observation. And especially about diagnosis. I think that very often people with disabilities feel that that the story about us is only about our diagnosis. And when you say people want to ask questions, is it that they want to ask questions uh, about anything other than how we got to be the way we are, right? The diagnosis question. They want to know, often that's the dominant narrative, the diagnosis question. So disability rights has really made great efforts to try to introduce other kinds of narratives that are not the medicalized, or what's usually the problem, the pathologized narrative. So the diagnosis narrative, as a narrative, one of the problems with it is that the resolution or the moral is overdetermined. That is, that the only possible satisfactory outcome can be a cure, which means that people who live without a cure can't tell their story. Your story doesn't exist if it isn't a story about a cure or
overcoming.
Or overcoming, right? So the only possible narratives in a pathologized narrative are the diagnosis with the cure, the overcoming narrative, or the inspirational narrative. And that inspirational narrative is similarly problematic. So if the only morals that one can be satisfied with these stories are those, then people can't tell their own stories of their experiences of living day to day with a disability that is just the way life is. It's just a different way of life. It's not a pathologized way of life.
That takes us to your framework of small world stories. Because when one offers counter diagnosis, it is not about going the macro way. It is about just my immediate environment, my own small world, where things commingle. So, what is this small world, and does it have a bearing on stories and their experiences, Amy?
So there's quite a bit of research right now on what are called small stories. They're not small world stories. They're small stories, and that's the narratives of everyday life, and that's what you're talking about. So, and really, I've spent my whole career looking at these narratives of everyday life, the ways we tell stories in our everyday lives. When I wrote about, though, I just want to mention, when I write about small world stories, I'm also writing about something else, which is in English, in the United States anyway, when you tell a story about a coincidental meeting to someone else, with someone else, like if you and I were to start talking and we would find out that actually we know someone in common, who I spend a lot of time in Italy, and maybe you've been to Italy, and we find out that we know the same person, we might at the end of that story say, wow, small world. In other words, that the world is small because of the coincidence, which is a different thing than small stories. So, but the small stories, the everyday stories, and I prefer to call them everyday stories because I think they're often not small in the sense.
I know, it's not small. Yeah,
that's okay. Many people call them small stories, but I think that that's where, for me, the most interesting work is in disability studies, is in these narratives of everyday life and the ways people describe the things that happen to them and who they tell those stories to. Who are you in dialogue with when you tell a particular kind of story?
So, in small stories, there may not be a listener at all, or the listener may be implied. It could be a conversation from within, or it may a conversation of no consequence, but still they are significant in offering counter diagnosis. Is that a fair understanding, Amy?
Do you mean that you're telling the story to yourself?
Yes, I mean, yourself not in internal conversation, but within the four walls. They may not be of bigger consequence, but still they make all the difference to the person telling the story.
Yes, I think those stories do have listeners. I mean, I think the stories are the other people in the four walls with you, or yourself, and I think they have tremendous consequence. I think that we narrate our lives constantly, and that's how we make meaning of them. And then when we're unhappy with how we feel about something, often the way to approach that is to think about narrating it differently. That is to position, and this is a word I use a lot, the word position, to position yourself and others differently in the story. So I think that's a, a large part of what disability rights activists are doing is positioning themselves in another place, not on the sidelines, but at the center of their own stories. So this is very important for small stories. So if you can position yourself at the center of your story, then you might think differently about the things that are happening to you. I can give an example here. Um, one of the things that fascinates me that I talk to my students about sometimes is that when my students with disabilities come to the university and live at the university, they experience a kind of autonomy that they haven't had before living at home. And and I love listening to their stories about this because they're very complicated. So on the one hand, they enjoy the autonomy. There's five hands here, probably not one hand, two hand. But so first they enjoy the autonomy. Second, they think deeply about the ways they want to be and don't want to be dependent on others. And I think we fail sometimes to listen carefully to the complexity of this for people with disabilities. All of us in the world, disability or not, have to figure out our dependence on others. But people with disabilities have thought about it more deeply, and their stories about even very small things. What do you decide to do at a moment when you could rely on someone else, but you choose to or not to? Those stories, I think, are really important. So for my students, they are everything from deciding if the wheelchair that they have doesn't fit between the doorway of a particular building, or maybe the restroom or the toilet stall of a particular building, what should they do? Should they ask to have the doorway widened? Should they get a new wheelchair? Should they figure it out somehow? And that's a question. And who should they ask to help them? So it can become a disability rights kind of narrative where they're asking for something that they think ought to be changed, or it can become a very personal question. Or the same thing happens when if they get an inconsequential illness while they're at the university away from home, they've been accustomed to asking, they always say it's their mothers, but I would say their parents, but they've been accustomed to asking their mothers for help with all things related to their medical needs. Do they want to continue to do that? Maybe that's a good idea. If they do that, do they think that then their mothers will take too much control over other parts of their lives? Is it possible to have your mother only involved in your medical it's not decisions, but medical appointments? If the mother is involved in your medical appointments, is she then going to think she can make the decision about them? If she thinks she is involved in your medical appointments, does she also have some control over your eating habits, et cetera, et cetera? So these narratives that my students tell to each other and to me and are small. They're all small stories, right? They're small stories about, well, I wanted to ask my mother to send me this food because I can't get it here, but I really don't want to involve her in my life, and especially not in my eating right now. So it would be a narrative, right? And those small stories about dependency, I think, are so rich and so much more, they have greater complexity than anything else that I've read about interdependency, which is, I think, a major question we have in our society right now, whether it's the former dependency of the colonies on the colonizer, and then that kind of autonomy or independence, or the mutual interdependence of nations or trading partners. You know, the big questions about interdependency, I think, are not understood with as much complexity as my students, I think, understand them in small stories about dependency and autonomy.
Wow, wonderful. I want to say this, Amy, having heard this from you. Uh, I think disabled people also work on this very deeply depending on their life courses, stage of life, context, and what situation or climate, social climate they are in. For example, for a young person in a college, like the ones that you're talking about, uh, maybe their sense of pride as individuals, young persons, may be more important. And maybe for a middle-aged person like me, the notion of my integrity may be more important. And maybe for an elderly person with a disability, the fear of abandonment may be lurking in the background when they want to make decisions about how to tell stories and revise stories and get things done. I mean, by way of dependence, interdependence, and autonomy. I mean, achieving balances between all these three frameworks.
Exactly. Oh, exactly. So, and I love the way you phrased it. So, if we listen to the stories of the elderly, for example, instead of worrying about, um, uh, so my elderly aunt recently had a very minor car accident. She scraped the side of her car against another car, so no one was hurt. No one was hurt, but there, I just told you a narrative, right? My elderly aunt scraped the side of her car against another car. So that story can become about many things. It can become about, should people her age drive? Does she have is she going to hurt someone? You know, this time nothing happened. But for her, I think it was about um, the fact that she would have to make all of the arrangements to fix the car. She wanted the mirror was cracked. That's all that happened. So her narratives are all about fixing the crack in the mirror. They have nothing to do with whether or not she should be driving. And I will listen endlessly to her telling me all of the stories about getting that mirror fixed. And that's her narrative. She does not want me or to start to ask her if she should be driving. And that would be a narrative that would be violate her sense of her freedom, independence, right? But it's also about abandonment in that sense, because I think at a deeper level, what she needs from me as a listener is to listen to her story, as it's about the cracked mirror. And what do you do if you're 90 years old and your mirror cracks and there's a virus going on, so you can't just call people and have them drive you somewhere. So my job was to listen to her story about a cracked mirror and all the things she was doing, and listen in order to not abandon her. To I think what would make her feel abandoned is if I started to ask her if she should still have the car. Do you understand what I'm saying? I mean, it's so particular.
Yeah, I know it can be existentially threatening.
Yes, exactly. It can be existentially threatening. So the question is for everyone, for all of the people, the college people, the middle-aged people, the elderly, when someone's telling a story, what is it for them that is existentially threatening, right? So it might be the same question across all groups, but the experience of being young or middle-aged or elderly is so different that what's existentially threatening is different. And the narratives are a place for us to pay attention to that.
So, storytellers may be laying boundaries, implied boundaries, but beyond which they don't want stories to mutate or travel.
Right, right. So my aunt would not be happy if her story about her cracked mirror were told as a story about whether or not she should drive. I think she would be okay with what I'm saying, or I wouldn't be saying it to you. Right? I think that she would feel validated. She's probably not going to listen to this interview. There's not a chance. But I feel ethically bound to think about that as I tell it to you. As I felt ethically bound when I told you the other stories about my students. I just made stories travel 2 times in the last few minutes, right? So I told stories about my students, but I told those in a very general way. But still, the students who told those stories would recognize themselves in the stories I told. And my aunt would definitely recognize herself because I said she's my aunt. So I just made stories travel, and I told them for what I thought, or I'm claiming, and you could, or other people listening to this could disagree. And if you disagree, then I think it's very important that you articulate that for yourself if you don't have a chance to write to me about it. But this is very important that we have this conversation about the ethics of how stories travel. So I was attempting anyway, as I always do, to be very conscientious about these stories traveling. And I'm suggesting in both cases that they were for a greater good. So in the case of the students' stories, there was a moral to my story, which was that that these students in their narratives know a great deal about interdependency, and we should listen to them. Similarly, when I told the story about my aunt, the moral was that, as you said, that we should ask, how does she experience this as being existentially threatening, this scratch on her mirror of her car? So I think we always have to ask, when we retell someone else's story, we have to ask, is the moral traveling with it? If it doesn't, I mean, I don't think my aunt is very interested in the issues I'm raising here today, for example. I mean, I could call her up on the phone right now and ask her, and I think she would say, no, not particularly. And I will do that if you like me to. I'll call her. But she would say she's not particularly interested, but she'd say, if you're interested, that's fine. I mean, she wouldn't feel violated. So it's not the case that we share, that the interpretation is shared, right? It's more a case, it's more important that we ask whether the changed interpretation is a violation or exploitation. So it is going to happen that we change, that when we tell a story, we tell it with a new moral or a new interpretation or in a new context where it has a different meaning. And the question is, does that new meaning violate or exploit the person? So that's what happens with inspiration narrative. And I'm sure many of the people listening already know about that. But if you tell me a story about something that you did and you feel good about having done it, and then I tell that story as an inspirational story, I'm violating you in that particular different interpretation. And so we're starting to name some of the ways that the stories told by people with disabilities violate people with disabilities. We're starting to have some names for them: overcoming, inspiration, and we're starting to recognize that those are interpretive moves that violate the person or exploit the person.
So that there is something inherently, there are some inherent problems maybe with transvaluation or allegorization, because when stories travel beyond the storyteller, they can also gain allegorical dimensions. And what that does, I learned from your writing, is that they also make it make the stories stay nowhere. They are everywhere, but they are decontextualized and they don't have the value that was attached in the first place. Is that a fair understanding, Amy?
Yes, this is the question that interests me most. You have it absolutely correctly. Whenever we tell someone else's story outside of the context of that person, we allegorize it. And allegorization, which makes a story larger than life. So whenever we make some person's story larger than life, larger than the context in which it happened, we allegorize it. And we do this all the time. This is we love stories that are larger than life. That's what's most compelling, is stories that are larger than life. My aunt's story is not larger than life. No one is going to repeat it because it's not even interesting that my aunt scraped the mirror of her car and then she had to figure out what to do about it. It's a very small story. But stories that can be allegorized are very compelling to us. And whenever we allegorize, allegorization is always potentially dangerous. And we do it all the time. That's what most fiction is. Most fiction is allegory. It's larger than life stories. It's taking a particular story and saying this has bigger meaning than just this person. This story has a larger meaning. So to say that stories are larger than life allegorizes them and subjects them to that danger that the philosopher Jacques Derrida described it as a dangerous supplement. The additional meaning, the supplementary meaning that you give to it that makes it larger than life is always dangerous. It's also very compelling. So we're not going to stop doing it. I'm not suggesting that we should or that we can, but rather I think we need to pay attention to the ways that it's dangerous and understand it in particular with relation to disability.
And maybe allegorization also puts a ban on newer travel possibilities, because it's it's like saying this is the ultimate place. It's like a river joining an ocean. I mean, now that it has a transcendental meaning, there is a moratorium one can have from this point, and therefore it's a final resting place. I'm just making it. I'm just dramatizing it, but I thought that's what they do.
That's true, and that's very interesting. That I love that idea that stories can have this kind of final resting place where that meaning takes hold. I think that's true. That particular meanings can take hold. That's probably a good example of that is pity narratives. That once the pity narrative takes hold, it's like the river joining the ocean, and no further movement can take place. I think that's very true.
Right. I can't believe that an hour is almost over. I mean, it's just, it's an experience talking to you, Amy. I learned so much, and so will be the listeners. But do you have a few words to add, and then probably we'll say bye to our listeners?
I'll say that the more we pay attention to the narratives that are told by people with disabilities, the better we'll understand and be able to reclaim that presentation of self. So I think it was good that you spoke about the small stories, that we need to pay attention to those stories, not just the big memoirs that are published by people with disabilities, which are also very, very helpful. That's another place where we find the reclamation of narratives about disability is in memoir. We didn't get a chance to talk about how that can be complicated. Both can be complicated, but it's a place to start. So I'll end there.
Thank you so much, Amy. Thank you so much.